Gavin Porter stood by the window of his high-rise office, his gaze sweeping over the San Francisco skyline. A satisfied smirk played on his lips as he took in the city below, a city that, in many ways, felt like his own empire. And why wouldn't it? His tech company, Porter Innovations, had just wrapped up yet another record-breaking quarter. Stock prices had skyrocketed. Investors were practically foaming at the mouth over their profits, and competitors, they were left scrambling in his wake, struggling to keep up. At 45, he maintained a sharp, athletic build that made him appear at least a decade younger. His salt-and-pepper hair was styled to perfection, giving him an air of distinction, wisdom without the weight of age. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he commanded, his tone crisp and authoritative. His assistant stepped inside, a neat stack of reports balanced in her arms. "The quarterly figures, Mr. Porter," she announced, placing them on his desk. "And your wife called. She wanted to remind you about tonight's gallery opening." Gavin's jaw tightened ever so slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Isabelle, his trophy wife. The woman every executive in Silicon Valley secretly envied him for. Right now, she was probably twirling in front of some mirror, deciding which designer dress would best showcase her flawless figure. "Thank you. That'll be all," he said coolly. Lately, his marriage had begun to feel like an obligation. Isabelle was breathtaking, no question about it. But her constant need for attention, the way she always seemed vaguely dissatisfied, it was beginning to wear on him. He was running an empire, for God's sake. He couldn't be expected to coddle her every insecurity. Still, appearances had to be maintained. The image of the powerful, enviable couple was good for business, even if, behind the scenes, it was becoming nothing more than a well-rehearsed performance. Across town, in their sprawling Pacific Heights mansion, Isabelle Porter stood before a full-length mirror, but her expression was far from the self-satisfied one Gavin imagined. Her perfectly manicured fingers fumbled with the clasp of a diamond necklace, another extravagant gift from her husband. At 32, she was still undeniably stunning. Long, honey-blonde hair, flawless skin, and a figure that turned heads wherever she went. But lately, the admiring stares of strangers felt meaningless. What was the point of being desired by everyone else if the one person whose attention truly mattered barely looked at her anymore? She thought back to the early days, the beginning of their marriage when Gavin had been attentive. But as Porter Innovations grew, so had the distance between them. Now, she was lucky if he made it home for dinner twice a week. Her gaze drifted to the invitation resting on her vanity. Another art gallery opening. She'd go, of course, smile, laugh at all the right moments, charm the right people. That was her role. But deep down, she longed for something more. Something real. Something that would make her feel alive again. She had no idea that her life was about to take a turn she never saw coming. When Isabelle arrived at the gallery, as always, the venue was already alive with chatter and movement. She moved gracefully through the crowd, effortlessly accepting air kisses and compliments with the kind of polished ease that only years of practice could bring. As expected, Gavin was nowhere in sight. No doubt he'd show up an hour late, stay just long enough to make an appearance, then slip away again, citing some urgent business matter. By the time she reached her second glass of champagne, she noticed him. Tall, dark, unruly hair. A mischievous glint in his piercing blue eyes. Unlike the sea of polished tech moguls and their perfectly manicured wives, he stood out. He was studying a large abstract painting, his head tilted slightly in curiosity. Before she even realized what she was doing, she found herself walking toward him. "Fascinating piece, isn't it?" she remarked, her voice laced with playful sarcasm. He turned to her, and for a moment, she felt her breath catch. His gaze was sharp, full of something she couldn't quite place. Something reckless. Something dangerous. "Oh, absolutely," he replied, effortlessly matching her tone. Especially how the artist captures the crushing existential dread of modern society through the bold use of, he paused, eyeing the chaotic blue streaks on the canvas, what appears to be random paint splatters. Isabelle laughed. A real, unfiltered laugh. one she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. "I'm Isabelle," she said, extending her hand. He took it, his grip lingering just a beat too long to be appropriate. "Mason Archer. The pleasure's all mine, Isabelle." As their conversation flowed effortlessly, something inside her stirred, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Mason was everything Gavin wasn't: present, passionate, spontaneous. He spoke of his art with a self-deprecating humor that was both refreshing and disarming. They were so wrapped up in conversation that Isabelle didn't notice Gavin's arrival until he was standing beside her. "Darling," he greeted, his tone polite but edged with something sharper. "I see you've made a new acquaintance." A flicker of guilt passed through Isabelle, though she quickly buried it. She hadn't done anything wrong, at least, not yet. "Gavin, this is Mason Archer. He's an artist." "Mason, this is my husband, Gavin Porter," she said smoothly, attempting to keep her voice casual. The two men locked eyes in silent assessment. Gavin extended his hand, his grip just a fraction too firm. "An artist? How fascinating," Gavin said, though his tone suggested he thought it was anything but. Then, turning his attention back to Isabelle, he added, "I'm afraid I'll have to steal my wife away, Mr. Archer. We've got some business to attend to." "I'm sure you understand," Gavin said smoothly. As he led Isabelle away, his hand rested possessively on the small of her back. She stole a final glance over her shoulder, catching sight of Mason, who was still watching her leave. That playful, knowing grin lingered on his lips. For the first time in years, she felt a spark, something real, something alive. Isabelle had no idea that her every move was being monitored. The fact that she was still married and receiving expensive gifts from Gavin was only because she had never been caught seeing other men. But over the past week, she had been meeting with Mason, and that couldn't go unnoticed, especially with a private investigator watching her. Gavin, however, was not a man who tolerated humiliation. One evening, seated in his private home office, he stared at the damning evidence spread before him. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk as a cold fury coiled deep in his chest. The photographs left no room for doubt. There was Isabelle, his wife, wrapped in a passionate embrace with Mason Archer. Gavin had sensed it. The sudden enthusiasm for art galleries, the unexplained charity events, the way she had become increasingly distant. She had kept her phone close at all times, withdrawing from him piece by piece. Still, he hadn't expected her to be so brazen, to parade her affair so recklessly under his nose. Standing near the door, Andrew Hayes, the private investigator Gavin had hired, remained silent, knowing better than to offer apologies or pity. His job was to deliver the truth, and he had done it well. "These are the originals?" Gavin's voice was eerily controlled, his eyes never straying from the incriminating photos. "Yes, sir. No copies, no negatives. Everything is also on the flash drive," Andrew confirmed with a curt nod. Gavin leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had built an empire from the ground up, crushed competition without hesitation. Did Isabelle honestly believe he would simply accept this betrayal and move on? "You're dismissed, Andrew. Your final payment will be transferred in the morning," Gavin said, his tone ice cold. As the investigator exited, the door clicking shut behind him, Gavin let go of the last remnants of control. With a sudden, furious sweep of his arm, the photographs scattered across the desk flew into the air, drifting to the floor like fallen leaves. The anger burned hot and fast, but just as quickly, it faded. Gavin Porter didn't lose control. He calculated. He planned. And when the moment was right, he struck with ruthless precision. Picking up his phone, he began making calls. The first, to his bank. Joint accounts were frozen, credit cards canceled. The second, to his lawyer. Divorce proceedings would commence immediately, with the prenuptial agreement enforced to the fullest extent. Finally, Gavin ascended the stairs and made his way to the master bedroom. Isabelle was out, undoubtedly at another one of her countless charity functions. Gavin called the housekeeper and ordered her to pack Isabelle's belongings into suitcases. Designer dresses, exquisite lingerie. Everything was carefully folded and placed inside. Then, he took his wife's jewelry box from the dresser, its sparkling treasures gleaming under the light, and carelessly tossed it into the suitcase. Their value no longer mattered. Once everything was ready, he sat at the desk and penned a brief, detached note. You wanted freedom. Now you have it. Don't come back. Within the hour, the locks were changed. Across town, Isabelle Porter was blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit her. She was lost in a haze of champagne and adrenaline, completely immersed in Mason's world. A stark contrast to the sterile, calculated perfection of the Porter mansion. His loft was messy, chaotic, alive with the scent of paint and passion. They barely made it through the door before the clothes started flying. Later, tangled in Mason's sheets, a flicker of guilt crept in. But it was fleeting, easily dismissed. Should she feel worse about betraying Gavin? Maybe. But in Mason's arms, she felt seen. For the first time in what felt like an eternity. We should leave together, Mason murmured, his lips trailing along her collarbone. I've got a show coming up in Paris. Come with me. Isabelle hesitated, her mind racing. The idea was insane. Leave Gavin? The life she had built around being Mrs. Porter? And yet, yes, she whispered before she could stop herself. Let's do it. Her fantasy shattered the moment she returned home. Sliding her key into the lock, she turned it, but it wouldn't budge. Frowning, she tried again. Nothing. Confused, she rang the doorbell. No response. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted the suitcases, neatly stacked outside the door. A single note was pinned to the handle. As she read Gavin's cold, brutal message, the blood drained from her face. He knew. But how? Panic surged through her, clawing at her throat as she pulled out her phone. She swiped her credit card. Declined. She tried another. Declined. In a matter of hours, Isabelle Porter had gone from Silicon Valley royalty to nothing. Homeless, penniless. Her hands trembling, she dialed Mason's number. He'd understand. He'd help. The moment he answered, she knew something had changed. The warmth in his voice was gone, replaced by something colder. I'm sorry, babe, he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. But I've got a career to think about. I have a lot of work to do. I need to prepare for my show coming up in Paris, and I can't afford to get tangled up in all this drama. A beat of silence. Then, the line went dead. Isabelle sank to her knees on the doorstep of what had once been her home. She had gambled everything on a fantasy and lost it all in a single night. Meanwhile, Gavin was already 3 steps ahead. He knew Isabelle might retaliate, perhaps even lash out in anger, trying to damage him or the company in revenge. But Gavin Porter was never caught off guard. He had increased his security, built a protective wall around himself, both personally and professionally. Yet, what he hadn't anticipated was the sudden appearance of Gabriel Delgado, his longtime business rival. Sensing blood in the water, Gabriel saw an opportunity. As whispers of Gavin and Isabelle's crumbling marriage made their way through the industry, Gabriel launched his attack. A hostile takeover bid designed to destabilize Porter Innovations, accompanied by a smear campaign meant to shake investor confidence. Gabriel's team worked around the clock, digging into Gavin's past, searching for anything that could be used against him. But Gavin Porter was most dangerous when cornered. As Isabelle wandered aimlessly, cut off from the only life she had ever known, Mason Archer was crafting a plan of his own. He might have lost interest in her, but he wasn't about to let an opportunity slip away. With a few carefully chosen photographs and some well-timed pressure, Mason figured he could milk a fortune out of Gavin Porter. A little blackmail, a little leverage. It was a simple plan, one built on arrogance and greed. What Mason didn't know, however, was the kind of man he was dealing with. He was about to poke a sleeping bear, and when Gavin Porter struck back, he wouldn't miss. Seated in his office, Gavin swirled a glass of untouched scotch, his mind already 10 steps ahead. His enemies thought they had him. They had no idea what was coming. To an outsider, Gavin Porter might have looked like a man on the brink, betrayed by his wife, under siege by his enemies, his empire crumbling around him. But that would have been a grave miscalculation. Behind the cold, steely gaze, plans were already in motion, strategies aligning with ruthless precision. He wasn't defeated. He was waiting. The phone on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Porter," His assistant's voice came through, professional and calm. "There's a Mason Archer here to see you. He says it's urgent." A slow, knowing smile curled at the edges of Gavin's lips. "Right on schedule. Send him in." Mason Archer swaggered into the office, wearing his usual mask of arrogance, but the confidence didn't quite reach his eyes. Without a word, he tossed an envelope onto Gavin's desk, a weak attempt at dominance. "I think you'll find the contents very interesting," Mason said, trying to keep his voice steady under Gavin's unreadable stare. Gavin didn't even glance at the envelope. "Let me guess," he said, voice calm, indifferent. "Photos of you and my wife in various compromising positions. And in exchange for keeping them out of the press, you want what? Money? A stake in my company?" The smug grin on Mason's face flickered. This wasn't going how he'd imagined. "Look, Porter, I'm giving you a chance to keep this quiet." Gavin cut him off, his voice chillingly soft. "You wouldn't, Mr. Archer." He leaned back, pressing a key on his keyboard. The computer screen rotated toward Mason, revealing a detailed dossier, a trap long in the making. Fraud. Khan's fake identities. Every dirty secret Mason had ever buried, laid bare. "While you were busy snapping photos," Gavin said smoothly, "I was busy learning everything there is to know about Mason Archer." He let the words sink in before adding, "Or should I say, Anthony Harding? Michael Torres? You've had quite a few names, haven't you?" The color drained from Mason's face. "How did you?" he stammered. "I have resources you couldn't begin to imagine," Gavin said, voice like ice. "Now, here's how this works. You're going to hand over every copy of those photos, every scrap of evidence of your little affair with my wife." Gavin leaned forward, eyes locked onto Mason's. "Then, you're going to disappear. Because if you don't, I will bury you so deep in legal trouble you won't see daylight again this decade. Are we clear?" Mason nodded frantically, his bravado evaporating. He stumbled toward the door, eager to escape, but Gavin's voice stopped him cold. "Oh, and Mason?" Gavin's voice was soft, almost amused. Mason turned, terrified. "If you ever come near me or my company again, what I've done today will feel like a warning shot. Now, get out of my sight." As the door clicked shut behind the retreating figure, Gavin allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. One threat down. But the real battle was just beginning. Across town, Gabriel Delgado was celebrating. His hostile takeover bid for Porter Innovations was gaining momentum. Investors were nervous, the board was starting to ask tough questions, and it looked like Gavin Porter's empire was teetering on the edge. But Gabriel had made a fatal mistake. He assumed Gavin, still reeling from the personal scandal with Isabelle, was too distracted to fight back. He couldn't have been more wrong. Even as Gabriel toasted his supposed victory, Gavin was already moving his pieces into place. Loyal employees were mobilized. Industry allies were rallied. A counteroffensive was launched with surgical precision. Leaks hit the press, exposing Gabriel's shady business dealings. Key investors hesitated, their confidence shaken. And through it all, Gavin remained unshaken, his public image one of unyielding control. The tide began to turn. Gabriel's power play started to crumble. What had seemed like a certain victory was rapidly spiraling into a humiliating defeat. And then, Isabelle returned. She stood on Gavin's doorstep, a ghost of the woman she used to be. Gone was the polished, untouchable socialite. In her place was someone disheveled, broken. Rumpled designer clothes, smudged makeup, hollow eyes. But it wasn't just her. She was holding a baby. "Gavin," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." She cradled the infant tighter. This is your son." For the briefest moment, something flickered in Gavin's chest. A shred of pity, maybe even regret. But he crushed it just as quickly. Isabelle had made her choice. She had betrayed him, humiliated him. She had thought he was weak, that he would never recover. And now, she was here, begging. His gaze dropped to the baby, his mind already calculating the possibilities. "Come in," Gavin said, voice devoid of warmth. "We have much to discuss." As Isabelle stepped inside, Gavin closed the door behind her, his expression unreadable. The rules of the game had changed, but that was fine. Gavin Porter was nothing if not adaptable. Gavin leaned against his desk, towering over her. Gabriel Delgado. I know you've met him at those insufferable charity events you used to drag me to. I want you to get close to him. Feed him information. Information I'll provide. Her eyes widened in shock. You want me to spy on him for you? Think of it as penance, Gavin said coolly, his tone dripping with disdain. You were so eager to betray me before. Now, you can put those skills to better use. Isabelle swallowed hard. This was not the reunion she had imagined, not the forgiveness she had hoped for. But what choice did she have? She was broke, homeless, and had a child to protect. And Gavin? Gavin was always 10 steps ahead. Gavin held all the cards. And if I do this? Isabelle's voice was barely above a whisper. You'll let us stay? Gavin's smile was razor-sharp, predatory. I'll consider it, he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. But understand this, Isabelle. One misstep, his voice dipped, cold and calculating, and you'll regret ever setting foot in my office. Do we understand each other? Isabelle nodded, feeling the last remnants of her dignity slip away. As she walked out, Gavin allowed himself a brief moment of triumph. He had just turned his greatest liability into a strategic asset. When Gabriel Delgado was brought to his knees, Isabelle would be discarded like yesterday's news. Meanwhile, across the city, Gabriel Delgado was unraveling. His once promising assault on Porter Innovations had stalled. Investors were pulling out, the media was turning skeptical, and the once impenetrable Gavin Porter was still standing. Storming around his office, his disheveled hair and clenched fists betrayed his frustration. How is he still standing? He snapped at his team. He should be reeling. One of his advisors hesitated before replying, Sir, we underestimated Porter's resilience. Gabriel slammed his fist onto the table. Excuses won't cut it. I need results. Find me something, anything, we can use against him. Just then, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. A flicker of hope sparked in his chest as he answered. Hello? A familiar voice came through, quiet but steady. Mr. Delgado, it's Isabelle Porter. I have information that might be of interest to you. Gabriel's eyes gleamed with predatory delight. This was exactly the break he needed. A chance to turn the tables on Gavin Porter. What Gabriel didn't realize was that he was walking straight into a carefully laid trap. From the confines of his home office, Gavin observed the unfolding game with quiet satisfaction. Isabelle had done exactly as he had orchestrated, reaching out to Gabriel, offering him just enough bait. Now, it was time to tighten the noose. Lifting his phone, he dialed. Andrew, I need you to monitor Isabelle closely. Every move, every conversation. If she breathes without my permission, I want to know about it. Andrew Hayes, ever the dutiful right-hand man, responded without hesitation. Understood, Mr. Porter. I'll get started immediately. Gavin hung up, a satisfied smirk creeping onto his lips. Isabelle thought she was playing a dangerous game, but in reality, she was nothing more than a pawn, one he fully intended to sacrifice when the moment was right. Weeks passed as Isabelle fed Gabriel a steady stream of information, each tidbit carefully curated to deepen his overconfidence. Blinded by his hunger for victory, Gabriel devoured every lie she spun, convinced he was on the brink of dismantling Porter Innovations. But even the best-laid plans encounter unforeseen complications. Once a close friend of Isabelle's, Sienna had always been jealous. The beauty, the wealth, the seemingly perfect life. Now, as Gabriel's personal assistant, she saw an opportunity for revenge. It happened by chance, a casual run-in at a coffee shop. Isabelle, exhausted from her double life, almost walked past her without noticing. Isabelle. The voice was syrupy sweet, but laced with malice. Isabelle turned, forcing a polite smile. Sienna. What a surprise. They exchanged pleasantries, but Sienna's sharp gaze lingered, taking in Isabelle's tired eyes, the absence of her wedding ring. Sensing weakness, Sienna leaned in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You poor thing. Is Gavin treating you badly? You know, I work for Gabriel Delgado now. I'm sure he'll enjoy tearing down your husband's empire, and with it, your entire world. Panic surged through Isabelle. This wasn't part of the plan. Moments later, Isabelle stood in the bathroom of Gabriel Delgado's penthouse, gripping the sink with trembling hands. What had she done? She had just handed Gabriel a key to Gavin's empire. Not the fabricated intel Gavin had fed her, real, actionable information she had uncovered herself. She saw a fool, about to make the same mistake twice. Back at Porter Innovations, Gavin Porter allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Sir, his assistant's voice crackled over the intercom. Mr. Delgado's company just made the move you predicted. Gavin's eyes sparkled with cold triumph. Excellent. Initiate Phase 2. He had anticipated Isabelle's betrayal. It was woven into her very nature. That's why the vital intel she had uncovered was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. A financial death trap designed to lure Gabriel into his own ruin. And it worked perfectly. As news broke of Gabriel Delgado's catastrophic business decision, Gavin relished the chaos. One enemy destroyed by the hands of another. But Gavin Porter never left loose ends. It was time to deal with Isabelle and her treacherous little friend. Across town, Sienna Reed was celebrating. She had finally outmaneuvered Isabelle Porter. Gabriel Delgado was elated, already planning his takeover of Porter Innovations. He promised Sienna a substantial reward for her help. Then, a knock at the door. Sienna answered, frowning. Gavin Porter stood there, flanked by two imposing men. Her blood ran cold. Hello, Sienna, Gavin greeted smoothly, his voice velvet over steel. I think it's time we had a chat, don't you? Her breath hitched. How had he found out? What did he know? As Gavin stepped into her apartment, reality slammed into her like a freight train. She had underestimated him. And now? She was about to pay the price. Gavin's voice was calm, measured, but his eyes were ice cold. He laid everything bare. Her past crimes, her manipulations, the envy she had harbored toward Isabelle for years. He had it all. Dates, times, witness statements. Enough to send her to prison for years. And just like that, Sienna Reed realized the truth. She was never the predator. She had always been the prey. Please, she whimpered, her last shred of defiance crumbling. I'll do anything. Just don't turn me in. A slow, predatory smile spread across Gavin's face, his satisfaction glinting in his cold, calculating eyes. Oh, I know you will, Sienna, he murmured smoothly. In fact, you're going to help me tie up the last loose end in this little drama. An hour later, Isabelle's phone buzzed. Sienna, emergency. Meet me at the usual place. Now. Her nerves bristled as she slipped into the dimly lit cafe. Had something gone wrong? Had Gabriel started to suspect her? But the moment she spotted Gavin sitting at a corner table, her stomach plummeted. Sienna sat beside him, her face ashen, her eyes red-rimmed. Gavin? Isabelle's pulse hammered. This wasn't part of the plan. Gavin sat there, looking entirely at ease, like a predator that had already won the hunt. Sit down, Isabelle, he said, his voice deceptively soft. It's time we cleared the air, don't you think? And then, he dismantled her, piece by piece. Every lie, every scheme, every betrayal. He had known everything from the beginning. You see, Isabelle, he murmured, his tone almost gentle in its cruelty. You never stood a chance. You were playing checkers in a world of chess grandmasters. Mascara-streaked tears slid down her face. Everything had been for nothing. What do you want from me? She choked out, barely able to form the words. Gavin leaned back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. It's quite simple, really. You will help me obliterate Gabriel Delgado. Completely. And then, my dear soon-to-be ex-wife, you will vanish. Without a trace. Isabelle shuddered. And the baby? He will be taken care of, Gavin said, dismissively. He shouldn't suffer for your mistakes. But you? You will face the consequences of your choices. As they stepped outside, her old life disintegrated into dust. Gavin stood at the head of the conference table, exuding the unyielding authority of a man who had already won. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice an icy blade cutting through the room. Today marks the end of our adversary. The screen behind him illuminated, displaying a devastating financial projection. Gabriel Delgado has stretched his resources too thin. His company is drowning in debt, betting on a takeover that is as hollow as his ambition. A slow, satisfied smirk tugged at Gavin's lips. By this time tomorrow, Gabriel Delgado will have nothing. His team moved swiftly, every soldier in his private war eager to strike the final blow. And across the city, Gabriel Delgado was blind to the knife hovering over his throat. He toasted his supposed triumph, utterly unaware that the insider information he had relied on was nothing more than a carefully woven lie. And as Gabriel celebrated, someone else was plotting their next move. As dawn broke over the city, Gavin's final strike unfolded with surgical precision. Stock prices collapsed. Credit lines were cut. Bankruptcy rumors spread like wildfire. Gabriel watched in horror as his empire imploded. "This is impossible," he bellowed. "How could all our intel be wrong?" His panic turned toward Mason Archer. "You said you could bring Porter down." Gabriel snarled. "What the hell happened?" Mason, ever the survivor, adapted. "I can explain everything," he said, voice smooth as silk. "But not here. Meet me at Pier 17 tonight. I'll give you everything you need." Gabriel, desperate, clung to hope. "Fine, but this better be worth it." Across town, Gavin was finalizing the last details of his masterstroke. "Is everything in place?" he asked. Andrew smiled knowingly. "Yes, sir. The police have been tipped off about a major deal at Pier 17. They'll be there in force." Gavin chuckled, low and satisfied. "Perfect. Make sure Mason Archer is found with a briefcase full of secrets." It was poetic. The man who had tried to blackmail him would now be the fall guy in his final act of revenge. As night fell, Gabriel crept into the abandoned warehouse at Pier 17. Heart pounding with desperation, Mason was waiting, a cunning smile playing on his lips. "All right, Archer," Gabriel said, eyes sharp with suspicion. "Where's the intel?" But before Mason could respond, the warehouse doors burst open. Red and blue lights flashed. Sirens wailed. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "Hands where we can see them. This is the police." Gabriel froze, his face draining of color. Mason spun to run. Too late. Officers swarmed in. The moment was chaotic, blinding. But one thing was crystal clear. They had been set up. Gabriel screamed in fury. Mason cursed in terror. From the shadows, Gavin Porter watched, a predatory grin curling on his lips. His trap had snapped shut, with perfect, merciless precision. As the sirens faded into the night, Gavin pulled out his phone and dialed. "It's done," he said simply. Then he hung up, without waiting for a response. Because he already knew. He had one. The aftermath. Isabelle's phone buzzed. The message was brief. Final act complete. She stared at the words, feeling the weight of irreversible fate settle over her. Looking down, she saw the child sleeping in her arms, Mason's child. A pang of guilt and despair churned inside her. This innocent boy had been nothing more than a pawn in the ruthless war of power. Gavin had promised to care for him, but she knew the truth. Gavin Porter was not a man of mercy, and she had betrayed him twice. He would never forget, never forgive. By morning, the financial world erupted in chaos. Every major news outlet flashed the same images. Gabriel Delgado, disgraced, handcuffed, being led away by federal agents. Gavin Porter sat in his office, watching the headlines roll in. His phone buzzed incessantly. Reporters, investors, board members, all demanding to hear from the man who had once again outmaneuvered his enemies. But Gavin barely acknowledged the noise. He was already thinking ahead. His adversaries were crushed, but loose ends remained. Isabelle, and the child. With measured calm, he pressed the intercom. "Send her in," he commanded. His eyes darkened with purpose. It was time for the next phase of his game. Isabelle entered the room. Small, defeated, a shadow of the woman she used to be. The fire that had once captivated him had been extinguished, drowned beneath her poor choices and his relentless vengeance. "Sit," Gavin ordered. She obeyed. Her shoulders slumped, her gaze hollow. He studied her silently, then leaned forward. "I'm sure you've seen the news," he said smoothly. She nodded. Gabriel Delgado was finished. Mason Archer went to prison. Sienna Reed was nothing more than a forgotten whisper in the business world. Blacklisted. She won't find work in this city, or anywhere else. She's a ghost now. And Isabelle Porter? You have a choice to make, Gavin continued. Isabelle's head snapped up, a flicker of hope in her tired eyes. A choice. Gavin's expression hardened. Yes, he said. I promised to provide for the child, and I keep my promises. But his tone turned icy, unforgiving. You, however, have proven time and again that you cannot be trusted. He laid out her fate as if dealing cards in a high-stakes game. Option 1, you can leave now. I will set up a trust for the boy. He will have everything he needs, but you will never see him again. Isabelle gasped, her fingers clutching her chest as if he had struck her. Or, she whispered, terror pooling in her stomach. Gavin's voice was a blade. Or you stay. You work for me, under my direct supervision. Every move you make, every action you take, will be watched. You will have access to the child, but make no mistake. One misstep, one hint of betrayal, and you will lose everything. Tears blurred her vision. This wasn't mercy. It was a prison, a gilded cage, where she would always be under his control. Why? She choked out, her voice shaking. Why offer me anything at all? For a fleeting moment, Gavin's expression shifted, a flicker of something almost human. Because, despite everything, there was a time when I loved you. Isabelle froze. And that boy, Gavin added, his voice lowering, though he's not my son, deserves better than the life either of us had. His gaze locked onto hers, a silent warning woven into his sincerity. But don't mistake this for kindness. I will change my decision based on your behavior. Isabelle wiped her eyes, her heart pounding. There was only one choice she could make. I'll stay, she whispered, voice heavy with resignation. Under your terms. Gavin nodded once. The conversation now concluded. Very well. I'll contact you soon. Isabelle rose shakily and walked out of the office, her freedom lost forever. Gavin watched her go, then turned back to the window. Below him, San Francisco stretched out in endless lights and movement, a kingdom under his dominion. He had one. Completely. Utterly. His enemies lay in ruins. His position was unshakable. Isabelle, the woman who had betrayed him, the woman who had tried to manipulate him with a child that was never his, the woman who now had nothing. A new name, a new life, a shadow of herself. Across town, in a modest, nearly barren apartment, Isabelle Benson stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She barely recognized herself. The glamorous woman who once graced high society events, dressed in designer gowns, adored by the powerful and envied by the desperate, was gone. What remained was a weary, hollow-eyed figure, wrapped in the consequences of her own decisions. Her son's laughter echoed from the next room, innocent, untouched by the shadows of betrayal and retribution that had led her here. A bittersweet pang shot through her chest. He was the only pure thing left in her life. Then, her phone buzzed. A message. No name. Just an address, a time, and 2 simple words. Be there. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She knew exactly who had sent it. Gavin Porter never needed to sign his demands. His presence was carved into every command, every ultimatum, and she had no choice but to obey. The next day, Isabelle found herself sitting in a cold, impersonal office, across from the man who had once held her heart and now held her fate. Gavin Porter hadn't changed, still impeccably dressed, still sharp-eyed and unreadable, still the predator who had outplayed them all. She braced herself for the worst, but his next words shocked her. I've arranged a job for you, far from here. It won't be glamorous, but it's honest work. You'll be able to support yourself and the child. Isabelle blinked in surprise. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't punishment. It was something else, a sliver of mercy. Thank you, she whispered, her voice fragile. Gavin's expression remained impassive. Don't thank me. This isn't forgiveness. This is a way to ensure you stay far away from my life and my business. His next words hammered the final nail into her past. You'll receive an allowance for the boys' care. But if you ever try to contact me, or anyone connected to me, it all disappears. Are we clear? The air thickened between them. Isabelle nodded, tears threatening to spill. This was the final cut, the irrevocable end. As she stood to leave, his voice softened, just for a moment. I hope you find peace, Isabelle. She turned back, tears already streaking her face. And I hope the child has a better life than the one you nearly condemned him to. Isabelle fled, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality. She had lost everything. Her wealth, her status, her self-respect. But as she stepped onto the street, her thoughts turned to the little boy waiting for her at home. She still had one thing left, a chance at redemption. 5 years later, Gavin Porter's empire had only grown. He was no longer just a titan in the tech world. His power stretched beyond Silicon Valley, into industries and governments. His influence was unquestionable. But tonight, as he sat alone in his study, none of it mattered. In his hands was an old photograph, a snapshot of himself as a boy, standing beside his father. A kind smile, a genuine moment, taken just weeks before everything fell apart, before his father's business partners betrayed him, leaving their family with nothing. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Come in, he said, slipping the photo back into his drawer. His assistant entered, looking uncharacteristically uneasy. Mr. Porter, there's someone here to see you. Gavin's eyes darkened slightly. Who? A pause. Isabelle Benson. His fingers tightened around his glass. She says it's urgent. A slow, measured breath. Send her in. Moments later, Isabelle stepped inside. She looked different. Older, yes, but stronger in a way. There was no desperation, no pleading, just quiet dignity. But what drew Gavin's attention wasn't her. It was the young boy beside her, no older than 6, clutching her hand. Gavin, she began, her voice steady, though fear flickered in her eyes. I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I need your help. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You're a long way from where I left you, Isabelle. This had better be good. She swallowed, then spoke the words that changed everything. I'm dying, Gavin. Silence. Cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. She gestured to the boy beside her. This is Elias, my son. And you're the only one who can give him a chance at a life after I'm gone. Gavin's jaw tightened. You have no right to ask me for anything. Isabelle flinched, but stood her ground. Because you're a better man than Mason ever was. And because this child is innocent of our sins. Elias looked up at Gavin with curious eyes. And for the first time in years, Gavin Porter hesitated. For the first time in years, Gavin Porter considered a future that wasn't built on control, revenge, or conquest, but on something real. Isabelle's words had unsettled him, stirring something he had long buried. And because she had hesitated, then added, I think you need this as much as Elias does. That single sentence had lingered in his mind. Now, as he looked down at the boy, his boy, he saw a reflection of himself, a child hardened by loss, but unbroken. Elias's defiant gaze met his, that same fire Gavin had once carried when the world had abandoned him. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Gavin spoke. I'll consider it, but I make no promises. Isabelle let out a shaky breath of relief. Thank you, Gavin. That's more than I dared to hope for. She and Elias left the office, and Gavin turned back to the window. But this time, his mind was no longer on the city he had conquered. Instead, his thoughts were on the future. A future he never imagined for himself. He pulled out his phone. Lays, I need a full background check on Isabelle Benson and Elias. Leave no stone unturned. As he hung up, his eyes drifted toward his desk drawer, where he had hidden the old photograph of his father. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, something that might have been hope. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Isabelle's condition deteriorated rapidly, but she faced her fate with a quiet strength that surprised even Gavin. And Elias? He adapted. Resilient. Observant. stronger than any child should have to be. One crisp autumn morning, the call came. Isabelle had passed away in her sleep. As Gavin set down the phone, a profound realization washed over him. The decision about Elias had been made long before this moment. Later that day, he found the boy sitting alone in the hospital waiting room, small and lost in a world that had suddenly grown too big for him. Gavin knelt down, meeting Elias's tear-filled gaze. His voice, for the first time in years, softened. "Elias," he began carefully, "I'm not your father, but I promise you this. I will give you the life your mother wanted for you." The boy nodded solemnly, his small hand reaching for Gavin's. And Gavin took it. In that moment, something shifted within him. The ice around his heart cracked, just a little. As they walked out of the hospital together, Gavin realized something astonishing. For once, he wasn't just a king on a chessboard of his own making. He was a father, a mentor, a man finally free of his past.